السادة الحضور، سوف تبدأ الآن أعمال الجلسة الثانية بعنوان الاستدامة وتطبيق مبادئ الحوكمة المنظور الرقابي. يسرني دعوة الدكتور كونستانتين سريان لإدارة الجلسة، والمتحدثون فيها هم السيدة فيانا جوردان، السيد ستيفن فيشر، الدكتور موفق اليافي، والسيدة روان عويدات. نطلب من السادة المتحدثين التكرم بالصعود إلى المنصة.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and before I start the panel, so first of all, I would like to say thank you to Qatar Financial Market Authority, our hosts, for their hospitality and kindness. Also, I would like to say thank you to the Union of Arab Securities Authorities and personally to Mr. Jalil Tarif. Mr. Jalil has always been our good friend of ours, and I'm glad that you are organizing this third conference. I have participated on the second one, so I'm looking forward for having more conference from your side. So let us start the panel, and as we are behind the schedule, so probably we'll be able to accelerate this discussion, and we will have kind of a friendly and open discussion regarding sustainability and the governance. And however, a lot of thoughts has been raised already and discussed on the panel before, and all the topic has been about sustainability itself. So, and let me start the panel with the following. So OECD on an annual basis collects the information regarding the governance itself and sustainability. And I would like to ask Fiona for sharing those insights and probably some of the highlights related to sustainability and the governance. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. Marhaba. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really great to see so many familiar faces and make new friends in the region after working many years with this region, and I thank Jalil for the generous and kind invitation. Just a little bit of quick background for those who are not familiar. The G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance were just revised in September last year, and I just want to recall the three main objectives because they're linked very much to the discussion we're going to have on this panel. The first is the principles help companies improve access to finance, particularly from capital markets, and by doing so they promote investment, innovation, productivity growth, and foster economic dynamism. So that's the first objective of the corporate governance principles. The second is to provide a framework to protect investors, including household savings. And third, they support sustainability and resilience of corporations. So since this was mentioned in the first panel, I just wanted to briefly refer to those objectives of the new principles. So as you can see on the slide here, I'm just going to focus very quickly on the disclosure and board elements. We collect data we publish every 2 years on 49 jurisdictions, OECD countries, G20 countries, and a few emerging markets. The 2023 fact book has data up to the end of 2022. And so what I'm going to cover here is in line with the new chapter of the G20 OECD principles on sustainability. And here the corporate sector plays a central role to advance the transition to sustainable and low carbon economies. And in fact, we identify climate change as a financial material risk for listed companies, and this represents 2/3 of global market cap. Sustainability-related disclosure is required by law or in regulations in nearly 2/3 of the 49 jurisdictions. In 12 jurisdictions, sustainability-related disclosure is recommended. So we look both at what is mandatory and what is voluntary, either in codes or principles. So this includes sort of comply and explain approaches. So in addition to recommending disclosure of all sustainability-related material information, the principles also recommend that for companies to establish targets, they should also disclose the metrics. So, like, how do we know that this is reliable? We need to understand the metrics to be able to look at the progress towards the targets. And we see 53% of the jurisdictions surveyed require or recommend disclosure of metrics for sustainability-related targets. Information on a company's sustainability-related risks and opportunities and how it manages them are material for investor decisions. So access to material sustainability information is crucial for market efficiency and to protect investors. Out of the 44,000 listed companies globally, this is about a total market cap of $98 trillion. Almost 9,600 disclosed sustainability-related information in 2022 or 2023. This represents 86% of global market cap. We also look at greenhouse gas emissions in terms of Scope 1, which covers emissions directly from the activities carried out by the company, and Scope 2, which covers indirect emissions, and Scope 3, which looks at the supply chain. Globally, 6,300 companies, representing 77% of market cap, disclosed Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions in 2022. And 43% of companies in China and 92% in Europe. Scope 3, we see less disclosure. In 2022, 60% by market cap reported Scope 3 emissions. And then in 70% of companies by market cap, we see a disclosure of the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And nearly half of them are set for 2030 as the target year. The baseline year is available only in 37% of the cases. So there's a lot of data there. There's a lot more to say. We do have a global sustainability report that was just published, which you can find a lot more rich information. Very quickly on boards. What is the role of boards in all of this? We see that a number of companies have established special committees on sustainability, but this is not the only way to do this. Companies representing more than half of the world's market cap have established committees to oversee the management of sustainability risks and opportunities, reporting directly to the board. In the US, 75% of companies by market cap have a sustainability committee. In Asia, excluding China and Japan, Europe and other advanced economies, it's more than 50% of companies that have such committees. On the other hand, to fulfill their key functions in assessing the company's risk profile and guiding their governance practices, boards also take into consideration sustainability risks when establishing key executive compensation. So this is another new important element. And while companies representing 85% of global market cap have linked executive compensation to these performance measures, 3/5 of these include a variable executive remuneration based on sustainability figures. And we see that executive compensation is linked to sustainability in 80% of the companies by market cap in Europe, followed by advanced markets and the United States. In Asia, it's quite low at this point at only 20%. And I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Stephen, so in the first slide, Fiona highlighted, let's say, the principle of the main regulation kind of approaches. So what are your views regarding what should be the regulation-wise, the approach, whether it should be mandatory, comply or explain, or a voluntary basis?
Sure, great. Thank you, Konstantin, and I think it's a great question, and thank you to the Union of Arab Security Authorities for the kind invitation, and it's great to be back in Doha and to share some ideas on this important topic. What I'm about to say really follows nicely on from what Fiona has outlined in terms of the principles, but before I get into addressing your question directly, just very, very briefly, I'd just like to describe a little bit around how we organize ourselves in Deutsche Bank to deliver on our ESG commitments. But even before then, I'd like to sort of take a step back and think about if, when we think about ESG, it sort of rolls off the tongue now. We always talk about ESG and don't give it a second thought if these are even sort of coherent groups, coherent ideas to kind of fit together. And I would suggest that they're probably not. If you think about environment, social, how do you actually measure these, and what is governance doing there as well? What I'd suggest is that actually governance, corporate governance, is the toolbox within which you can unlock your commitments and your principles and your values regarding the environment and the social element. So I think that's important to keep in mind. So over recent years within Deutsche Bank, the governance, so the functions, the committees, the processes, the roles, have all been adapted to execute on delivering our ESG commitments. This starts with the management board, and the related oversight sits with the supervisory board, which is typical in a German corporate governance construct. The bank has 2 committees, 2 forums, 1 council, entirely devoted to sustainability. We have a strong governance with a CEO-led group sustainability committee consisting of management board members at the senior-most levels, ESG business heads, and the chief sustainability officer being the vice chair. And this is the main sort of governance body of Deutsche Bank for all sustainability matters. The CEO is ultimately responsible for developing group strategy and for driving and coordinating its implementation across all businesses, infrastructure units and regions. And this includes risk, data and innovation. And the CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer, manages the implementation of the strategy via key deliverables for which he is accountable. So where does this get me in terms of answering your question? I think our experience is that a principles-based approach works well. But within that principles-based approach, we need a wide consensus globally. We're a global bank active in many, many different markets. But the firms need that space to be able to adapt and adopt the principles to their own corporate structure. And I strongly believe that supervisors should hold firms to account, and they should actually look at these structures and challenge in terms of their implementation as well. But ultimately, to stand the best chance of success, I think we're going down the route of a principles-based approach here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Indeed, I agree that when we are talking about ESG, basically there are 3 these components: environmental, social, governance. But I believe that everything should start from the governance itself, because if you are not changing the mind of how the companies are running, in terms of both, business-wise and also related to environment and social aspects. So it could become a kind of a greenwashing, etc. However, I think at the first point, it could be also the case, the greenwashing itself. But in the next stages of development, there should the understanding of the importance of the environmental social aspect should also come into place. And with that question, I would like to ask Dr. Mawafaq regarding so what should be the role of regulators in, first of all, shaping good corporate governance principles in companies, and then probably how to move forward with the later 2, environmental and social.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Before I reach to this, when I started, because I want to make this preface before I give you my opinion.
Yep.
When I started reading about governance in 1998 and then started lecturing about it and then tried to spread the word about the importance of governance in all institutions, the reaction of the business environment in the Arab countries is that theoretical. And then I started thinking how to transfer this theory into practice, because the OECD really is issuing excellent standards and principles, really. And for me, they are clear, but since I'm an auditor, I always think how to apply the standard to be practical in the application. So that's why I published the book on a guide on how to apply it on banks. And it's the first guide in the world. However, the issue is it only a principle or how to apply it? So we need the guidance to apply it. So to go back to the question that whether it has to be it has to be obligatory or voluntary, anything that is voluntary, no one would apply it, especially in the Arab countries, and especially in the world. And today, as long as the world doesn't know the importance of applying ESG, of applying ES, because with the gas emissions that our colleague just mentioned, this is part of the problem. This is a big part, but it's the only part. We in the Arab countries, we extract oil and gas, so we give emissions to the world. So what are we going to, how are we going to compensate this? So approaching this and tackling it touches the lives of everybody, not only who are living here, but mostly who are living here in the Arab countries. And people don't know how this impacts their health in the future. Sometimes people believe that the avoidance is not important, while when the problem comes, we tackle it. No, preventive is always better, and it takes away big issues away from us. So we need to tackle it in a preventive way, so that approaching the environmental and the social issues helps our communities, our societies, our economies, and the health of us and our next generation and generations to come to be better. So this is how we need to approach it, because the level of awareness in our region is below. If you ask even the professionals, do you think that we need to apply environmental and social standards? They would say it's spending money, it's too much, why should we apply it? So the issue is the understanding, the comprehension of the issue is not there. We need to work on this matter, and I believe the OECD and other organizations need to invest in this matter on the awareness of it. And the role of the regulators is to push, not voluntary, to enforce it, and this enforcement has to be clear, strong, and adaptable, doable.
Yeah, thank you. It comes to the discussion we had before the panel with Fiona regarding how to educate and how to teach kids, actually. And sometimes when you can leave, let's say, in this case, you can leave the organizations to do it by their own when they will come to their mind that this is important. On the other hand, from the regulator perspective and from in general, the community countries and globe perspective, you should enforce and you should push them to do that. Otherwise, in future, it will be already late to think about that. So, and coming to the region, Raman, so how do you see ESG disclosures in the region now?
Oh, it's working now. All right. So yeah, that's a good question. I think what we are seeing, that disclosures in general are improving, they are picking up, but clearly there is room to grow. This also includes ESG disclosures. So, for example, in some markets, such as the UAE, for example, you have mandatory ESG disclosure requirements for the publicly listed entities, while in other markets, such as, for example, in Saudi and Qatar, there are more in terms of the voluntary guidelines that what we just touched on a while ago. So clearly, there is a ramp up, but there is a room to go. But maybe also something to add, that earlier last year in January, the Unified Sustainability Metrics disclosures were introduced. These are also voluntary, but includes factors such as greenhouse gas emissions, power and energy usage, gender pay, which should also help start standardizing the disclosure requirements in the region. So yeah, I agree that also publicly listed entities form a small portion of the total entities in the markets, and this was touched on in the previous session, but there is also a pickup in terms of ESG disclosures.
Yeah, thanks. Now let's move to the incentives, because when we are talking about mandatory things, despite the fact that those are beneficial in future, but still it looks, I mean, perceived by the companies like you are burdening us with additional costs. So, and from that perspective, what we are getting of that, I mean, what we should do, besides the fact that everything will be bright in the future, or not will be dark in the future. So what about incentives? And with this, so Fiona, when it comes to the investors, when it comes to the investors, because also Tajinder has mentioned that, if I remember correct, so $4 trillion funding is increasing annually, so it's huge amount. So the demand is there, and Dr. Farid has been also telling that demand is there, it's about the supply. So now let's talk about the investment side. So what's the investor's profile looks like?
Excellent question. Can I ask the team please to put up the slide on the data that we have on this? I would appreciate it. Can somebody please put up the slide? Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Excellent. So yeah, I mean, we talk about investors, but of course they're not all the same. So, as we were saying, I mean, equity markets play a huge role in fostering innovation and facilitating long-term investment, which is what we always are looking for. So overall, when we look at climate change, it's considered, as I mentioned earlier, financially material risk for listed companies. That accounts for 64% of global market cap. And companies facing risks, when we talk about that, we talk about human capital, data security, but also ecological impacts. So companies from Europe, 33%, and US, 29%, represent the largest portion of companies with the highest disclosed GHG emissions. The extractives industry, in particular, accounts for 40% of the companies. But when we look on the other side, the ownership distribution of the top 100 high-emitting companies among different categories of owners, we see that globally, institutional investors hold the largest share, about 41%. In the United States, they hold 75%, in line with broader trends of institutional ownership in US equity markets. In China, the public sector plays a major role, holding 64% of equity in the high-emitting companies. Japan has a more balanced ownership structure with corporate holdings at 20% and institutional investors at 35%. And Europe has the more diversified investor base, including corporations 10% and institutional investors 30%. So I'd be very keen to hear from the private sector members of the panel, you know, what they see after looking at this global landscape of what the investor makeup looks like.
Yeah.
You know, what is their views?
Yeah, and as I see, so the majority, I mean, the demand mainly comes from the institutional investors' side, rather than from the private investors. Probably private investors are not so sophisticated yet, and they are not looking at that so much. For them, the yields are the most important probably at this moment. But institutional investors are changing the mindset of the entire world and the entire investors profile. So Stephen, with that, you can answer from a Deutsche Bank perspective or from the perspective of the other, let's say, activities when it comes to the investment. So what is your approach there?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, Deutsche Bank is, as you know, a large, globally active financial institution, and active here, of course, in Qatar as well. Albeit we're anchored in Germany, and therefore we're subject to the EU framework. So when you say, what do we see, what does the private sector see, we see a whole lot of complexity. And we see a very high bar which we have to meet, which is effectively set in European regulation, which then influences and dictates how we approach everything on a global basis as well. Just to spend a couple of seconds on where we are in Europe, because that gives the context to kind of how we think about this. You know, the EU has really put itself at the forefront of ESG and driving a very high standard around environment, and it's tried to do that globally by adding in an element of extraterritoriality as well. And I think Europe is increasingly becoming self-aware about how it is perceived in the rest of the world as well. So in other words, is it right for Europe to go around the world and say, actually, if you want to sort of participate in our market, you've got to reach this very, very high and complex barrier. And I think you'll see in the next 5 years of policy making some tweaks to that, although the fundamental elements of the framework will not change. What Europe does do is it focuses on corporate and product transparency for investors. So it effectively gives the data to allow investors to better scrutinize investments on a consistent basis. And as a bank, we benefit from that because this improved data situation allows us to have a deeper look into our loan book and effectively allows us to decarbonize our loan book as well. But I mean, I think one thing which we're not really talking about really is the transition. What we would like to do is to free up more and more balance sheets to finance those companies which are on the transition from brown to green. And this is very, very difficult to capture in regulation. So here again, I think we're looking at a principle-based approach around the transition is probably the best one to go for. And the real driver of change in the market, in my view, is the Net Zero Banking Alliance, at least on the banking side. And what we have done actually is just recently published our own transition plan, which looks at 7 sectors. It looks at oil and gas, power generation, automotive, cement, coal mining, steel and shipping. And we're following those Net Zero Banking Alliance principles to get there. So where I'm going with this is, you know, regulation fundamentally important for setting a really high bar, but ultimately we need to be realistic in terms of where the market is and where we want the market to go. And instead of focusing on perfect, instead of focusing on rewarding deep green, let's think about a way in which we can incentivize companies to get on that journey and move on that transition from brown to lighter green and eventually to deep green. And that's where those principles play a really important role.
Yeah, great, thank you. Dr. Mawafaq, so when it comes to the, again, we are going to talk about governance, and when it comes to the boards in the companies, what should be the role of the board and every board member in order to push this forward? Because when it comes to the governance perspective, if we are taking that from the investor side, investors are shareholders, they want more profit, etc., etc. Probably in some cases they are not care about that if those are not institutional ones about ESG. So, and the board should take a role there or not?
Well, I was a politician for 17 years advising the Prime Minister of Lebanon, and I know that I did not succeed because I was so much frank in the way I express myself. So I'm expressing myself now. We want boards to abide and comply with international standards. We need to incentivize them, and if they don't apply, we need to penalize them. We need to compensate whatever they are losing, because you mentioned that any company that its main aim is to make profits, and the investors whom we believe that the investors are looking for ESG, investors are looking for more profit. So far, the world system is able to penalize someone who declared an opinion, and or if we doubted that his or her revenues might be laundered, so he or she would be listed and he will be sanctioned. Today, these companies, tell me about a company that is worsening the world, that is giving the world emissions that are bad, and that is doing bad things to the world, that was sanctioned. This is nothing is happening. No, I didn't hear about this so far. So without enforcement, there is no application. But also, without compensation and giving tax incentives, lower interest rate, providing them with facilities, giving them open markets. Without doing this, we will not succeed in applying this. So it takes two to tango. We need to be able to understand this from the perspective of the investor, who is a normal investor, and from the perspective of the government itself. So governments worldwide who are getting aid, who are getting assistance from the World Bank or the IMF, they need to link this also to their compliance with the ESG and so on. Because if we only talked about it, we will never reach it. We need to have a stick to tell the one who is not complying that you are not allowed to continue.
Yes, thank you. Rawan, so when it comes to the green bonds, so what are the main drivers in the region for issuing those, and how, from your opinion, how to motivate the companies to issue green bonds?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I think it's important to just set the scene that the private sector, including capital markets, is needed to help fill the gap for financing the transition, right? So on a global level, we expect the global green, social, sustainable, and sustainability-linked bond issuances to hover around the $1 trillion level this year, slightly higher than 2023 levels, and translating into an overall market share of somewhere between 14 to 16%. And specifically for the region, we also expect to see growth in the region in terms of the GSSB bond issuances, albeit coming from a relatively low base. You know, the region comprises somewhere less than 3% of the sector's total issuances. But maybe just to go a bit deeper on the region, we expect the UAE and Saudi Arabia to remain the largest issuers, and we continue to expect the large corporates, including the government-related entities, to continue to drive with these issuances. But based on what we've discussed in terms of the sector's, the region's high exposure to hydrocarbons, you know, the sector comprises somewhere between 70 to 80% of central government revenues on average. We expect to see that green bonds will remain prevalent. And as a reminder, these are financial instruments that raise funds for projects with environmental benefits, including, for example, green buildings, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, for example. So for climate mitigation, we continue to see that hydrogen and renewables will remain key in terms of the use of proceeds. But in terms of climate adaptation, given the region's high exposure to water stress and heat waves, we think that these will continue to remain priorities. But maybe here, just to stress, we think that the pace of the decarbonization strategies will be important to see how these issuances will grow and the pace of this growth.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Now let's move to the recommendations. So what to do to increase, first of all, ESG disclosure and how to make the sustainability happen in the companies broader than just only those who are for whom it is mandatory. And as far as I know, so OECD has also provided several recommendations in the latest report. So can you share that with us, Fiona?
Sure, thank you. And just very quickly, the principles are intentionally outcome-oriented, so that they can be adapted to countries around the world. And of course, we expect that regulators and stock exchanges and those who are responsible for codes use them to adapt them. But, you know, so it's very much about the outcomes, so it's intentional. But then, of course, we expect that, you know, in different regions, different countries, they will want to make it certain things mandatory, voluntary. And I did a little bit of homework before coming. I looked at 10 jurisdictions in the region and corporate sustainability disclosure. And in 4 out of the 10, it is mandatory. But very quickly, so I think the principles last year were quite revolutionary in getting agreement from OECD and G20 countries on guidance on sustainability. So really they aim to sort of help companies manage environmental and social risks, looking at disclosure, rights and responsibilities of shareholders and the board. Specifically, they look at guidance on the concept of materiality. That's incredibly important. Also support adherence to internationally recognized standards. We were talking about comparability earlier. This is incredibly important in a global marketplace. It's the same for sustainability-related disclosure. Third, verifiable metrics to be disclosed. Extremely important for publicly listed companies that set targets. Fourth, external assurance to provide objective assessment of these targets. You know, are we meeting them? Are the metrics legit? And finally, and this is why these types of forums are very important, dialogue between companies, shareholders, and stakeholders on sustainability matters. This is really important for decision-making, to have informed decision-making and to build, it was mentioned earlier this morning, trust, investor trust in the long-term strategy. I think this is also very important that we think long-term, and this is why the OECD is also very engaged in terms of capacity building in the region, and both in the Middle East and soon in Africa. And we look forward to working more closely together with many of the regulators in the room in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Cooperation is the key. So let me take one point from your list is standardization. So Stephen, there are a lot of standards developed over the past years. So in different industries, for different purposes in different countries, so a lot related to ESG. So what is your view regarding, so which one to take and which one to follow?
Yeah. By the way, my list was also, or Fiana's list is also my list, so I think that is the list in many ways. I've got here, what are our key asks to improve integration, compatibility, comparability, and keep the dialogue? So there we go. But no, on standards, I mean, I think the important thing is we reach a sort of global architecture on standards. And I think, you know, we are broadly agnostic, provided that there is a significant amount of firms which are reporting according to standards. So ISSB is there as a leading standard. I think the important thing with this whole endeavor around ESG is to bring as many sectors and as many companies, and what we're seeing in Europe, to bring popular opinion with you as well. So you need to do that in a way which provides consistency, where we can actually, you know, make progress on integration, comparability, and compatibility. But we do it in a way which is graduated, and we do it in a way which is tailored to different markets. And I think, you know, the International Accounting Standards work, ISSB is there as well. These, and of course, the OECD principles, doing slightly different things, are there as global standards for a reason, that they work effectively.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Moffat, so what about ISSB? I mean, whether it is relevant for the implementation, and what is that about?
The importance of ISSB is that they are issuing standards to harmonize the standards among every jurisdiction. To go back to what Dr. Farid mentioned, that we have the GRI, the TCFD, the ISSB now, and so on. Today, with the ISSB that issued the standards last year, we believe that if the world went towards these two, and to the third one, and so on, we will be able to start reading reports in a comparable way. The issue about standards, that if anyone, with all respect to all organizations who issued standards and principles, if anyone can issue a standard, then reporting comparability is not doable. And for us to be able to compare and read the development between one year and the other is not, we will not be able to do it. So the importance of ISSB is that it will bring down together the harmonization, the comparability, and bringing together all the professionals to provide almost a unique report according to certain standards, because without this, we wouldn't be able to read, because anyone who issues a report today without using the ISSB standards, he would call it an environmental report. On what basis? What are the standards? What are the principles that he or she relied on? This is not there. So I highly appreciate what the ISSB is doing now and believe that this is the future. But we need to convert these standards into guidance, into a way how to apply it, and not only consider them as principles and as theories. This is very much important to succeed in this matter.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, you are right. Dr. Farid has also been talking about that implementation. So, Rawan, when it comes to the region, the oil companies are one of the drivers of the economy. So, and how do you see the path to net zero for those companies particularly?
Yeah, that's a good question, and maybe it touches on what we were discussing earlier. Yeah. So basically what we are seeing is that the national oil companies in the region are aligning their strategies with the national sustainability targets, with the net zero commitments. But also we think that the transition will be somewhat challenging and will take longer compared with the internationally publicly listed peers. And this is mostly because of the high reliance of the regional economies on the sector, as we discussed, but also because we think that there will be less direct pressure from key stakeholders, whether it's the policymakers, regulators, or shareholders. So even if the energy transition is, even if the national oil companies in the region are as exposed to the energy transition compared with the international peers, we think that they have sufficient financial buffers to absorb incremental investments needed to adapt to the energy transition, at least over the next 3 to 5 years, while still preserving their credit metrics. And to basically gauge the impact on metrics, what we did is we devised a hypothetical and purposefully exaggerated stress scenario where we looked at the international peer group's spending needs and the contribution in low-carbon investments. And these included projects, for example, in renewables, but also in carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We also looked at the planned greenhouse gas reduction targets and extrapolated what that meant on the national oil companies in the region. And based on the stress test, what we estimated is that these regional national oil companies would need to spend somewhere between the $15 to $25 billion annually, at least through 2026. But even with these incremental investments in aggregate, the credit metrics in terms of net debt to EBITDA will still remain below the 2 times. So maybe here it's just important to highlight that this is, again, hypothetical, meaning that we don't necessarily mean that these investments will be fully materialized, for different reasons, but including differences in the energy mix. So clearly companies with higher refining exposure would need to spend more to achieve these targets. Secondly, the regional NOCs benefit from lower greenhouse gas intensity levels, which basically means they would need to spend less to achieve their targets. And maybe just lastly, I think we touched on it in the previous sessions, is the underlying environment has, at least in the short to medium term, shifted the focus from the question of energy transition to the question of energy security.
Thank you. And with this, I would like to wrap up our panel. If
I may add, because I totally agree with her, creating and encouraging the Arab bonds for environment and sustainability would help a lot all these companies finance certain projects to overcome the problem. So this is the issue of creating, and because so far it's very primitive, the market of bonds in the Arab market so far. Dr. Farid mentioned that they are not able to get the finance. So we need to encourage this, and this is doable by the IOSCO. I'm sure IOSCO can help and OECD can help.
Yeah, thank you. So takeaways. Oh, you have a kind of a...
No, I was just going to say we just came out with a report on the global bond market.
Great. So, key takeaways. Well, the role of boards we cannot underestimate, and the transition should come from inside the company rather than outside. Another thing regarding transition, Stephen mentioned that transition also should be incentivized somehow, because usually we have incentives for the final step or for the final results, but for the process which can take long. So that should be also incentivized. Regulator role, of course, is very important, and at least at this stage, where probably for some of the countries, it of course depends on the maturity of the market and maturity of the economy itself. But the role of regulator probably should be more at this point, and then to be reduced, not vice versa. And cooperation and dialogue. That's I guess the most important thing in doing that. In doing that. So yes, and with that, I'm giving the floor to Dr. Farid. You have a question, right?
It is a question, yes, if possible. Talking about incentives, one challenge that I got to see personally, and we got to see as Egypt, that there isn't any preferential treatment for these type of bonds. So we can be issuing sustainable bonds despite having much of a higher cost when it comes to verification of the underlying projects, that it is actually reducing carbon emissions, et cetera, that it has the continuous, I would say, follow-up and reporting on those bonds, because they need an annual report from an assurance body that these actually sustainability bonds are following what is meant to be doing. However, what we have seen that there isn't any preferential pricing from investors. So I'm just wondering, maybe we need to entice investors to put money where they're saying, basically, because they're saying, yes, we are in favor of sustainability bonds, we are in favor of environmental bonds. However, when it comes to pricing those type of bonds, when you get to price a plain vanilla bond compared to a sustainability bond, it would be the exact required rate of return or yield required on those particular bonds, which is a disincentive for companies and countries to move towards sustainability even further. So this point, if anyone has an answer for it, or an idea that we can be implementing local jurisdictions internationally to push investors to be actually doing what they're saying. Thank you.
It needs brainstorming in order to reach how to compensate and pay the difference or the preferential difference. It needs brainstorming on from where can we bring the subsidy.
I didn't mean it from a subsidy perspective.
Yeah, I know. Or preferential, but it will be, let's call it as it is. At the end, it's a subsidy.
Yeah, and by the way, Stephen, you have been working in BlackRock. So from the BlackRock perspective, be honest, let's say. So you are getting funding. So and you are going to invest, let's say. And so what should be the incentive for BlackRock, let's say, to invest in the ESG, the green bonds, compared to the standard ones?
Thank you. You put me in a difficult position to speak for my former employer. But as you were speaking, I was thinking through what would the answer be from that investor perspective. And you know, I know what the BlackRock answer would be in terms of you put it in an ETF. But no, I mean, there's a serious point beneath that, in as much as you try to sort of widen and commoditize the investor exposure to sustainable assets in the widest way possible. From a Deutsche Bank perspective, where I am now, it's really about, you know, following the investors. So it is all about the investors. In terms of, you know, the incentives, it's actually, a lot of this comes through mandates, and the institutional investors themselves and the shareholders, and this is what takes us full circle back to corporate governance, why this is so important. That really drives asset allocation. So if you're a Nordic, you know, or a Dutch pension plan, for example, with very, very strict environmental criteria, that drives asset allocation that way. And in many ways, the BlackRocks and the Deutsche Banks of this world just facilitate that as intermediaries. So it starts with corporate governance. It starts in the boardroom, and that has to be then written into the different mandates of the investors, wherever they may be.
But maybe here, just to add to this, is I don't think it's regional specific. Maybe for the region, we haven't seen a dedicated ESG asset managers or funds yet, like as big as we're seeing globally. But even globally, I don't think we are seeing strictly ESG sustainability related funds as much as is needed, basically.
Thank you. And with this, we accomplished our task, and actually in time. Are you satisfied? Very good. So thank you all. Thank you panelists, and thank you the audience, Dr. Farid, for participating.